Good day, students of economics, and welcome to this online video learning session, which explores four important macroeconomic concepts: economic growth, the business cycle, unemployment, and inflation. Economists use two tools to measure economic growth over time: real GDP and per capita GDP. Real GDP is aggregate output adjusted for inflation. Real per capita GDP is aggregate output adjusted for inflation divided by the population. The video will examine the source of economic growth, an increase in the quantity or quality of resources, and improvements in technology/productivity, with an emphasis on the latter, and discuss why economic growth is a vitally important economic goal. Topic number 2, the business cycle. Against the backdrop of long-run economic growth, the economy experiences fluctuations in aggregate output. The video will explain the reasons or rationale for business cycles, discuss the four phases of the business cycle, and look at some historical data of U.S. business cycles post-World War II. Topic number 3, unemployment. First, examine how the Bureau of Labor and Statistics measures the unemployment rate in the country. Second, discuss the three types of unemployment: frictional, structural, and cyclical. And third, and most important, measure and discuss the economic impact of cyclical unemployment. The last topic, inflation. First, measuring inflation using the CPI or Consumer Price Index. Second, identifying the two types of inflation: demand pull inflation and cost push inflation. And then finally, examining the economic effects of inflation. If a picture paints 1,000 words, then why can't I paint you? Beautiful song by the band Bread, recorded in 1971 and written by their lead singer, David Gates. This is a beautiful picture of post-World War II modern economic era of the U.S. economy. The horizontal axis measures 77-year period of time from 1947 through 2024. The vertical axis tracks changes in real GDP, aggregate output adjusted for inflation. The first lesson: in the long run, it's upwards and onwards. You can see the trend of the blue line. The average annual rate of growth for the U.S. economy over this 77-year period was roughly 3%. Second lesson from the chart: against the backdrop of long-run economic growth, aggregate output adjusted for inflation, increases in real GDP, the U.S. economy experiences fluctuations in aggregate output or business cycles. In the modern economic era, 1947-2024, 77-year time frame, there have been 12 economic contractions or recessions. These economic downturns are represented by the gray areas on this chart. The width of the gray area tells us something about the severity of the recession. There are three notable economic contractions: the mid-70s, the early 80s, and 2008-2009, which is now referred to as the Great Recession. The economic downturn of the Great Recession was so severe, it knocked the U.S. economic growth rate off kilter. It took a while for the average annual growth rate to trend back towards the long-run average. This chart of the U.S. economy from 1947 through 2024 serves as an excellent introduction to the four macroeconomic topics covered on this video: economic growth over this 77-year time frame, the rise in aggregate output adjusted for inflation or real GDP tracked by the blue line, business cycles, post-World War II, the modern economic era. The United States has encountered 12 recessions and therefore experienced 12 business cycles. Unemployment, which tends to increase beyond an acceptable level during economic contractions/recessions, and inflation. Concentrating our eyes on the last macroeconomic event on the chart. The 2020 COVID pandemic caused a severe and significant contraction of aggregate output when the U.S. economy was forced to voluntarily shut down large parts of production, followed by a surge in economic activity after vaccinations were introduced and the virus was somewhat under control. The post COVID era economic experience led to unacceptable level in inflation. All these topics will be investigated in much more detail throughout the remainder of this video. Can't sing the same song because although this picture highly resembles the one from the previous slide, this chart is a different macroeconomic measurement of economic growth over the same 77-year time frame. This chart measures aggregate output adjusted for inflation divided by the population or changes in real per capita GDP. Again, how is real per capita GDP calculated? Simply take real GDP divided by a nation's population to measure real per capita GDP. The trend is the same. Over this 77-year time frame, real per capita GDP has grown, and the average annual rate of growth in real per capita GDP is approximately 2%. Why is this such an important macroeconomic measurement tool of economic growth? In essence, real per capita GDP measures how each citizen of a nation shares in the aggregate output or production of the country. And increases in real per capita GDP roughly correlate to increases in living standards for the citizens of that country. It's important to remember economics is a social science. Recessions are not merely gray areas on a chart. Economic downturns affect the livelihoods of real people, and contractions in aggregate output lead to decreases in real per capita GDP, making it more challenging for average everyday Americans to make ends meet. Likewise, alterations in the growth rate of real per capita GDP affect living standards. In the 1950s and 60s, the average growth rate of real per capita GDP was approximately 4%. This fell to approximately 3% average rates of annual growth in real per capita GDP in the 70s and 80s. Over the last 2 decades, growth rates have been decreasing, with the average rate below 2% in the last 10 years. These trends are disturbing as already stated. Increases in real per capita GDP translate into increases in living standards for Americans. The hope is that technology and artificial intelligence will reverse this trend moving forward. Recall the lessons from the production possibilities model in terms of current limitations of production and economic growth moving forward. On this model, potential consumer good production is measured on the vertical axis. Potential capital good production is measured on the horizontal axis. Remember, consumer goods satisfy economic wants directly and immediately, and capital goods satisfy economic wants indirectly over time. The solid production possibility frontier represents the country's current limitations of production given fixed resources and fixed technology. A nation can shift its curve to the right or generate economic growth by increasing the quantity or quality of resources or increasing productivity/technology. In the real world, productivity gains and technological advancements generate 2/3 or 67% of all economic growth moving forward, and increases in aggregate output translate into increases in living standards for average everyday people. Again, the production possibilities model is not merely a two-dimensional graph. Understanding the social science implications of economic growth rates, small changes in the average annual rate of economic growth in real term translate into big differences in living standards over 10, 20 years. Mathematicians and statisticians employ the Rule 70 as an estimator to determine how long it will take a variable to double in value. The formula is straightforward. Simply take the rate of change of a variable, divide that number into 70, and it is a strong approximation of how long it will take that variable to double in value. For instance, assume your financial portfolio is growing at an average annual rate of 7%. 70 divided by 7, the rate of change, suggests that your financial portfolio will double in value approximately every 10 years. The approximation is darn close to the exact calculation one would measure using a complicated math formula and is in many cases good enough, especially for social sciences. Economists borrow the Rule 70 to determine how long it will take real GDP to double in value and per capita GDP to double in value. For instance, if an economy is growing at a 1% average annual rate of growth, it will take 70 years for that economic output to double. Economists use two tools to measure economic growth over a period of time: increases in aggregate output adjusted for inflation, or increases in real GDP. The second, increases in real per capita GDP. Simply take the real GDP number divided by the population to determine per capita GDP. In many ways, per capita GDP is a much better measurement of the economic well-being of citizens, as it roughly estimates how each person in the country shares in aggregate outputs. It is possible for a nation to enjoy an increase in real GDP while simultaneously suffering a decrease in per capita GDP if its percentage growth in population outpaces its percentage growth in economic outputs. Likewise, real GDP per capita is an imperfect statistic, like all macroeconomic measurement tools. Think of a country where the economic income generated from output is concentrated in the hands of a few. Saudi Arabia is such an example. On the surface, real GDP per capita appears strong in Saudi Arabia. Unfortunately, only a small percentage of its citizens enjoy the income. Percentage rate of growth in both real terms and per capita terms is a strong determinant of the standard of living and economic well-being of citizens of a country. Growth is advantageous because it reduces the burden of scarcity and increases living standards. Country X is growing at 2% annual rate in real terms. Country Y is growing at 4% annual rate of growth, real terms. Country X will double its aggregate output, or GDP, in approximately 35 years. Country Y will double its aggregate output in 17.5 years. This example demonstrates how small changes in the rate of growth have a significant impact on the overall economic well-being of citizens within a country. There are four factors from the supply side which are ingredients to economic growth. These include increases in the quantity and quality of natural resources, increase in the quantity and quality of human resources, increase in the supply of capital goods or stock of capital goods, and improvements in technology. Understand these four factors are not mutually exclusive. For instance, directional drilling and fracking, which was a technological advancement, allowed the United States to increase the quantity of fossil fuel resources through an advancement in technology, accessing these natural gas and oil deposits which were previously inaccessible. Increase in the quality and quantity of human resources. One key to increases in the quantity of human resources in the labor force moving forward is immigration. Productivity of labor, or the quality of the human resource, will be examined in more detail shortly. Increasing the stock or supply of capital goods. Remember, in 1 year, net capital measures the amount of money spent on gross business investment, new machines, equipment, tools, factories, intangible assets, minus depreciation. As long as net investment is positive, a nation's stock of capital is increasing. Improvements in technology. Obviously, AI is going to play a factor, but companies like MP Materials, which are advancing new approaches to extracting rare earth elements and manufacturing magnets, which are an important component in many advanced technological products, will also contribute to economic growth. Jean-Baptiste Say, French economist, proposed supply creates its own demand. However, Say's law is not completely correct as demand factors matter. C plus I plus G. Households, businesses, and governments must be in a position to purchase, and economies expanding output, and efficiency matters. To operate on the production possibilities curve, a nation must achieve efficiency through full employment of economic resources and productive efficiency, adopting the least cost method of producing goods and services. An alternative approach to measuring real GDP is to take the product of hours of work and labor productivity. Several factors affect hours of work. These include size of the working age population. Two issues are affecting size of the working age population in modern industrialized countries. These include low birth rates and an aging population. To a certain degree, immigration can alleviate the downside of these two issues. The second factor affecting hours of work, labor force participation rates. What percentage of able-bodied adults between 16 and 65 are working or actively seeking work? The labor force participation plummeted during COVID and has since rebounded to a reasonable level. The third factor affecting hours of work, length of the average work week, which is influenced by government and legal institutional considerations, collective bargaining agreements between unions and employers. Generally, in the European Union, the average hourly work week is lower than it is in the United States. Factors affecting labor productivity or average output per work hour include technological progress, quantity and quality of capital goods available to workers, efficiency of the allocation of inputs. Productivity rises with improvements in health, training, education, and motivation of workers, increases in the quantity, quality of machinery and natural resources, improvements in organization and management of labor, and reallocation of labor from less efficient industries to more efficient industries. The last factor is economies of scale. America excels at having large corporations which have made significant capital investment and therefore have achieved enormous economies of scale, leading to extremely efficient labor productivity. It's necessary to identify labor productivity as the key source of economic growth. Again, labor productivity measures average output per hour of labor inputs. Between 2007 and 2009, labor inputs increased by just 0.3%. Therefore, over that time frame, 82% of the 1.7 average annual growth of GDP can be attributed to increases in labor productivity. Recognizing labor productivity as the key to economic growth, it is important to examine three separate time periods of labor productivity in U.S. economic history. The first period of time from 1973 through 1995, the second period of time from 2010 until today, but it's the middle segment of time from 1995 through 2010, which is the one most interesting. First, from 1973 through 1995, the United States experienced a 1.5% average productivity growth in terms of labor productivity. From 2010 through today, that average productivity growth rate annually is approximately 1.2%. However, between 1995 and 2010, that average productivity growth was 2.8%. Why the anomaly? There are several reasons for the rise in average productivity growth in that time frame, 1995 through 2010. First idea is the microchip and information technology, which led to an array of new products and services and new ways of doing business. These included the pocket calculator, the bar scanner, personal computers, more powerful business computers, miniaturization of electronic circuits, which led to cell phones, GPS systems, Doppler radar, and gene sequencing equipment. The widespread availability of personal laptops and computers stimulated the desire to tie them all together. This wrapped them up into the development of the internet, and that led to e-commerce. The second factor was the growth of startups. Amazing companies that are household names today: Apple, Dell, Microsoft, Oracle, Cisco, Yahoo, and Google. Apple for both its personal computers and the iPhone, Dell for its personal computers, Microsoft for its software and eventually cloud computing, Oracle for its commercial software, and Cisco for its networking systems. Obviously, Yahoo and Google search engines. Other companies emerged from this infrastructure, including eBay, PayPal, and Amazon. The last factor is increasing returns. Some numbers are necessary to explain this idea. Assume a company has 100 workers and is producing 1,000 units. Therefore, one would assume that if we add another 100 workers, output would increase from 1,000 to 2,000. But with the rise of the microchip and technological progress, increasing workers from 100 to 200 increased output from 1,000 to 8,000. This was commonplace among the startups that were implementing microchips and technological advancements into the economic productive process. Part 1 of this video, investigating economic growth, culminates with an international comparison of the world's 10 largest economies. Note these are measured in current dollars, 2025, therefore nominal GDP equals real GDP. The United States ranks as the world's largest economy, producing $30 trillion worth of aggregate output. China ranks second, producing nearly $20 trillion worth of aggregate output. Germany, Japan, India, the UK, France, Italy, Canada, and Brazil round out the top 10 largest economies. But GDP is an imperfect tool to measure the economic power and prowess of a country. Living standards are better measured using per capita GDP. Although China ranks second in terms of total aggregate output, when taking GDP divided by population to calculate per capita GDP, China ranks 69th, coming in at just over $13,000 per person. The United States, the world's largest economy, ranks 7th in terms of per capita GDP. Another good comparison would be Canada versus Brazil. Looking at their total economic output, one would judge the two countries to be nearly equal. However, per capita GDP in Brazil is just over $10,000 per person, while per capita GDP in Canada is nearly $56,000 per person. One of the most interesting economic discussions and debates of the past quarter century has been how long will it take China to surpass the United States and become the world's largest economy. Recall, economists employ the Rule 70, the mathematical statistical tool, to estimate how long it will take a nation to double its economic outputs. According to the data on this chart, the United States is growing at an average annual rate of 2.2%, suggesting it will take the United States roughly 31 years to double its aggregate outputs. China, growing at 4.5%, according to this chart, will double its outputs in just 15 years. So-called experts and pundits predicted China would overtake the United States and become the world's largest economy by 2030. However, many factors have contributed to these so-called experts reconsidering their opinions, and now there are predictions that it may never happen. Part 2 of this video examines the economics of the business cycle. Against the backdrop of long-run economic growth, the economy experiences fluctuations in output. There are 4 phases of the business cycle: the expansion, peak, contraction or recession, and trough. There are several theories as to why business cycles plague economies, and it's important to examine some empirical statistics of the 12 business cycles of the post-World War II economy. Against the backdrop of long-run economic growth, the economy experiences fluctuations in aggregate outputs. There's these alternating periods of economic growth and contraction that plague the economy. There are 4 phases of the business cycle. As long as real GDP is positive, the economy is in the expansionary phase of the business cycle. Understand, just being in the expansionary phase of the business cycle does not translate into a strong economy, as economic growth can be anywhere from meager to stupendous. As long as the economy is experiencing growth, it is considered to be in the expansionary phase of the business cycle. Peak, temporary maximum in output. Think of the phases of the moon. Technically, the moon is only full for a moment. Same idea here in terms of the business cycle and the peak phase, a temporary moment in time where aggregate output is at its maximum. Recession, when the economy is contracting in real terms. Again, recessions can be mild or they can be devastating. If the economy is contracting, it is in the recessionary phase of the business cycle. And then finally, before a new business cycle starts, temporary minimum, a moment in time, the trough, the bottom of the business cycle before the economy turns positive again. This is the picture of where we started our discussion. However, it is vitally important for students to remember the long run trend. In the long run, the economy grows at an average annual rate of roughly 2%. But when teaching the business cycle, students often lose sight of the long run trend. Remember, the horizontal axis measures time, the vertical axis measures increases in real GDP. Over the long haul, the United States economy averages an increase in annual output or real GDP of approximately 2%. But understand, against the backdrop of economic growth in the long run, the economy experiences alterations or fluctuations in aggregate output, the boom-bust cycle, the business cycle. The horizontal axis measures time, the vertical axis measures the changes in real GDP, aggregate output adjusted for inflation. This chart does an excellent job of outlining the 4 phases of the business cycle. When real GDP is growing, positive, the economy is said to be in the expansionary phase of the business cycle. The peak, a temporary maximum in aggregate outputs, just before a downturn. A recession, 6 months, 2 quarters or longer of contracting GDP, and the trough, a temporary minimum, a point in time right before the start of the next business cycle. Unfortunately, this chart of the business cycle is somewhat misleading as it leads one to believe the undulations are perfectly even. In the real world, business cycles are not as predictable as this pretty picture. An economic expansion may last 3 years, it may last 12 years. An economic contraction may cause real GDP to decline 3%. It may be more mild where economic output only falls by 1%. Unemployment might peak at 11% during a severe recession. It may be only peak at 6 or 7% during a not severe economic contraction. Therefore, it is necessary to investigate some of the particulars of empirical data from modern economic business cycles. According to Einstein, everything in life should be as simple as possible, if not simpler. It would be so simple if the US economy would simply grow at 2.2% annually without fluctuations. However, it would eliminate the need for macroeconomists. What are the causes of business cycles? What factors lead to the alteration between expansion and contraction? Understand these 5 listed here are not mutually exclusive. Geopolitical events affects the confidence of individuals, institutions, and governments, and therefore affect economic opportunity and outcomes. Financial instability. Perfect example of this, 2009, the financial crisis. Brokerage firms in the United States overexposed to mortgage-backed securities and other debt instruments related to housing caused a serious asset bubble, resulting in a severe contraction of the economy. Financial bubbles have plagued economies since the beginning of mankind. The next one is an interesting approach to analyzing business cycles. Irregular innovation. The theory goes every so often a new catalyst is introduced that sparks exceptional economic growth. The railroads, the airplane, the internet, and perhaps artificial intelligence, that this spark, this catalyst, it causes economic output to exceed expectations for a time, but eventually when that spark sputters out, we revert back to the mean. Productivity measures output per unit of input. Changes in productivity highly affect economic growth rates and therefore business cycles. Earlier in this video, we examined labor productivity and discussed 3 distinct time frames in recent U.S. economic history, putting an asterisk in the time frame from 1995 through 2010 as a stellar segment of labor productivity caused by the invention of the microchip, the computerization of the internet, and the startups of large technology companies. Since then, labor productivity has fallen off a cliff. The hope is that artificial intelligence will reinvigorate labor productivity, acting as a catalyst for future economic growth. Monetary factors. Some economists believe all business cycles can be traced to policies of central bankers. The key of a central bank is to grow the money supply in conjunction with the economic growth rate. Too much money fosters inflation. Too little stifles economic activity. Sometimes it's difficult to get that equation correct. Monetary factors have been blamed for many business cycles. Remember, these factors are not mutually exclusive. They all influence one another at times. Chart investigates business cycles from the Great Depression through the year 2000. Identify first the zero growth line, the solid black line on this chart. From 1930 through 2000, if the economy generated zero economic growth, if aggregate output was the exact same, the blue line, which will appear shortly representing actual economic activity, would go directly through the zero growth line. Then the long-term average growth rate. On this chart, 3%. If there were no business cycles, the blue line, which again represents actual economic data, would go directly through the dotted long-term growth line. What about actual economic activity? Wow. First, evaluate the period from 1930 to 1950 with the radical swings. Why did the United States have radical business cycles prior to the modern economic era? The huge contraction in the 1930s, the Great Depression, the economy actually improved after the initial catastrophic downturn, only to suffer another large decline or contraction in aggregate outputs. Then the boom in economic activity because of the militarization of the US economy, unemployment got as low as 1%. The post-war era looks like an economic tragedy when you evaluate that high in the early 1940s to the extreme low thereafter, when in reality that was simply a readjustment of the US economy from military output back to civilian output. Notice that the post World War II modern economic trajectory is far more tame. Most, not all economists believe the use of fiscal and monetary policies to address economic business cycles is the reason why modern economic activity hovers closer to the long run average with less radical swings in business cycles. Listing the socioeconomic events over the same time frame provides better macroeconomic context. The Great Depression, starting in 1929, a severe drop in aggregate output, a greater than 50% decline in GDP, a brief economic recovery followed by another significant drop in aggregate output of greater than 30%, then the surge in economic activity associated with the militarization of the US economy in response to World War II, then the adjustment back to the peacetime economy, followed by the post-World War II modern economic era. Observe the modern economic era far less radical in terms of swings in the business cycle. Most, not all, economists attribute this to the theories of John Maynard Keynes and better government management of macroeconomic activity. The Great Depression was more than an economic downturn. It was a human calamity. Several factors contributed to one of the worst periods in American economic history. These included the stock market crash of 1929, where the value of equities on the New York Stock Exchange plummeted from 89 billion to 15 billion. Bank failures. Many banks failed due to panic withdrawals and insufficient reserves. Approximately 4,000 banks failed. The Dust Bowl. Severe drought in the 1930s devastated American agriculture, leading to widespread farm foreclosures, again exacerbating the economic crisis. The cycle of overproduction and underconsumption. The 1920s saw a surge in industrial production, but this outpaced consumer demand, leading to falling prices and profits. The overproduction meant there were too many goods chasing too few buyers. Excessive consumer credit. Easy credit in the 1920s allowed consumers to buy more than they could afford, leading to a buildup of debt and eventual defaults. Finally, international economic issues. The global economy was interconnected, and the depression of the US had ripple effects worldwide. Factors like the gold standard and Smoot-Hawley tariff, which imposed high tariffs, further restricted international trade, exacerbating the economic global downturn. Interrelated with the last issue was the monetary policy response. Our central bank, worried about an outflow of gold, restricted the money supply, which worsened the economic crisis. Simon Kuznets, the Russian-born American economist, later won the Nobel Prize in Economics for his empirical interpretation of economic growth, provided a way to quantify the severity of the economic downturn. Check out these numbers. From August 1929 through March 1933, 43 months, the U.S. economy declined by more than half. Aggregate output fell by 53.4%. The unemployment rate peaking at 25%. 1 in every 4 Americans was out of work. After a brief respite, there was a second phase of economic downturn from May in 1937 through June of 1938, lasting over a year, 13 months, with a further 32.4% decline in GDP and unemployment again spiking to 20%. The general consequence of the Great Depression was a reconsideration of government involvement in the economy. In his work, The General Theory of Employment, Interest, and Money, John Maynard Keynes argued the private sector, consumer spending, and investment spending may at times not provide significant aggregate demand to sustain full employment domestic output. In essence, Keynes argued it was necessary for the government to get involved through fiscal policy to assist the economy when it gets off track. Against the backdrop of long-run economic growth, the U.S. economy experiences fluctuations in aggregate outputs. This chart provides data for the business cycles 1950 through 2020, outlining that repetitive cycle of expansion, peak, contraction, trough. 3 areas, time frames of economic interest: 1973 through 1975, a recession lasting 16 months with a decline in aggregate output of 3.2%, and then the early 80s. First, a downturn lasting 6 months, then a recession lasting 16 months with a 2.2 and then 2.9% decline in aggregate output, respectively. The Great Recession started in late 2007, lasted through 2009, a year and a half, a 4.3% decline in aggregate outputs. And then the economic anomaly of the pandemic. It only lasted approximately 2 months, but a severe downturn of 10.1%. Economics is a social science. The previous slide provided information on the duration of economic recessions and the percentage decline in aggregate output, but what about the human factor? This chart provides information on unemployment rates during economic downturns. The unemployment rate during the pandemic reached nearly 15%, and then those 3 particularly bad economic contractions, 2 in the early 80s and then in the mid 70s, approximately 1 out of every 10 members of the labor force was unemployed. Economics is a social science. Consider how economic downturns affect the average everyday person and their ability to maintain their living standards. This video fully examined 2 of the 4 important topics of macroeconomics: measuring economic growth and the economics of the business cycle. The next video will examine the twin problems of business cycles, unemployment and inflation. Look forward to interacting with you in the next economic learning session.